The wind carried the smell of cooked food across the camp. Soldiers laughed inside the mess hall, their trays filled with hot meals. Outside, in the cold shadow of the wall, an alien woman stood trembling. Her skin was pale, stretched tight from hunger, and her clothes were torn. In her arms lay a small child, silent and limp, his eyes half closed. She clutched him closer and whispered to the guard at the door, "Please, may I have the leftovers for my child?" Her voice cracked, weak from 3 days without food. The guard sneered. He looked her up and down like she was nothing. "Get lost," he barked. "Food is for soldiers, not beggars." He turned away, pretending she wasn't there. The woman didn't move. She tightened her hold on her child and tried again. "Please, he hasn't eaten 3 days. Anything will do, even scraps." Laughter rang out from inside the hall. A group of soldiers had heard her words. One leaned against the doorway and called out, "Humans don't feed strays. Go back to your kind." The others chuckled, clapping their trays together. To them, it was a joke. But one man at a corner table stopped laughing. He lowered his spoon and stared at the door. His name was Daniel, a simple worker assigned to repair machines at the base. He wasn't a soldier, just a man who had seen too much war. His stomach twisted as he watched the scene unfold. The child in her arms looked so small, so fragile. Daniel remembered another child years ago, one he couldn't save. He pushed away his tray. The food was still half full, steaming in the cold air. He carried it to the door, ignoring the mocking whistles from his comrades. "Hey, Daniel," one soldier shouted, "you planning to adopt an alien brat?" More laughter followed. Daniel ignored them. He stepped outside. The woman flinched when he came close, pulling her child tighter as if afraid he would strike her. His voice was steady but gentle. "Take it," he said, holding out the tray. Her wide eyes glistened with tears. For a moment, she didn't believe it. Slowly, her thin hand reached forward, trembling, and she took the food. She whispered words in her own tongue, too quiet to understand, but the meaning was clear. "Thanks." The child stirred, smelling the food. His lips parted, and for the first time in days, a faint whimper escaped him. The woman quickly broke a piece of bread and pressed it to his mouth. He chewed weakly, every bite looking like a battle. Daniel watched in silence, his chest heavy with emotion. The guard scowled. "You'll get in trouble for this," he muttered. But Daniel didn't care. He turned his eyes away from the hall and focused on the woman and child. The woman lifted her gaze to him again. Her eyes were full of desperation, but also a flicker of hope. She bowed her head once, clutching the food close. Then she whispered, "Come." She motioned for him to follow. Daniel hesitated. He could already feel the eyes of soldiers burning into his back, ready to report him. But something stronger pulled him forward. He followed her through the narrow alleys of the alien quarter. The streets were cracked, the walls broken, and every doorway hid faces that stared at him with hollow eyes. Mothers clutching children, fathers too weak to rise, old ones lying on rags. The woman led him into a small shelter. Inside, the air was damp and cold. She laid her child on a ragged blanket. Daniel saw his tiny chest rise and fall with effort. The child's lips were blue, his cheeks sunken. She broke off another piece of bread, softening it with water from a cracked jug before pressing it to his mouth. The boy's hand twitched weakly as he chewed. A tear rolled down the woman's face as she looked at Daniel. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. He saw the truth in her eyes, gratitude mixed with unbearable pain. Daniel knelt beside the boy. His heart pounded as the memory of another small bed filled his mind. His daughter's face flashed before him, pale and weak, lost to sickness when no medicine could be found. He had buried her with his own hands. He remembered his wife's cries, the empty silence after. Now before him lay another child, another life dangling at the edge of death. He could not walk away this time. The woman placed the food on the blanket, then bowed low until her forehead touched the ground. Daniel reached out quickly, lifting her by the shoulders. "Don't," he said softly. "Don't bow. Just feed him." She stared at him with red, swollen eyes. "Why?" she whispered in broken human words. "Why help us?" Daniel looked at the boy again. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out. "Because no child should starve." The boy's small voice broke the silence, a faint sound, almost too weak to hear, a whimper that turned into a sigh. His hand reached out blindly, brushing Daniel's sleeve. Daniel froze, then gently placed his larger hand over the tiny fingers. The child clung to him. Daniel knew in that moment his life would never be the same. Daniel sat in the corner of the dim shelter, the sound of dripping water from the cracked ceiling filling the silence. The woman carefully cradled her son, feeding him crumbs softened with water. The boy chewed slowly, every bite an effort, his breathing ragged but alive. Daniel's eyes never left him. The world outside felt far away, as if this small room was the only place that mattered. The woman glanced at Daniel often, uncertain, as if expecting him to vanish the moment his kindness was spent. She didn't speak, but her trembling hands told him everything. Hunger, fear, and a desperate hope clung to her like a shadow. She offered him a cracked cup with the last drops of water. He shook his head. "For him," he said, quietly. The boy coughed, choking on a bit of bread. Panic shot through the mother's eyes. She tried to steady him, patting his back, but the child's thin body spasmed. Daniel moved quickly, his hands acting before his mind caught up. He leaned the boy forward, pressing gently against his back until the piece dislodged. The boy gasped, sucking in air. The mother let out a broken sob, clutching her son as if she would never let go again. Daniel sat back, heart pounding. For a moment he had thought the boy would slip away. The child's weak eyes fluttered open, and they landed on him. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, the boy breathed out one word. "Papa." The woman froze, her mouth parting in shock. She shook her head quickly and pressed her forehead to her son's. But the boy repeated it, soft and slow, as if naming Daniel was his only strength left. "Papa." Daniel's chest ached. He reached out without thinking and brushed the child's hair back. The boy's small hand tried to grip his finger, but barely managed. Daniel's throat burned, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Rest," he murmured, his voice low. The woman turned to him, her lips trembling. Her language was broken, but the meaning came clear enough. He thinks you will save us." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the child, who had already drifted back into weak sleep. In the silence, he heard faint footsteps outside, quick and light, then fading. He stiffened. Someone had been watching. The woman noticed too. She hugged her child tightly, her body shaking. Daniel moved to the doorway, stepping out into the narrow street. The shadows stretched long between broken walls, and for a moment he thought the street was empty. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A small figure darted behind a pile of rubble. He followed, his boots crunching on the dirt. The figure stumbled, and a thin alien girl appeared, no older than 10. Her face was sharp with hunger, her ribs showing through her skin. She stared at him with wide eyes, frozen in fear. In her hand was an empty tin can, rattling as she trembled. Daniel stopped. The girl's mouth opened, but no words came. She only looked past him, toward the shelter where the woman and her child waited. It was not the first time she had seen food change hands. Desperation burned in her eyes. Daniel slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the last piece of bread he had hidden from the mess hall. He held it out. The girl hesitated, then snatched it with both hands. She bit into it so fast she almost choked, tears streaking down her cheeks. She ran off without another word, vanishing into the dark alleys. Daniel returned to the shelter. The woman's eyes searched his face as if asking what he had done. He only said, "Others are watching. Others are hungry too." She bowed her head, silent. The child stirred in her arms, and she rocked him gently. Daniel sat down again, his mind racing. He had broken a rule tonight. Soldiers had laughed, but laughter could turn to whispers, whispers into reports. If words spread that he was feeding the enemy, he would not just lose his position, he would lose his freedom, maybe his life. Yet, as he looked at the boy's fragile chest rising and falling, he knew the choice was already made. He could not turn away, no matter the cost. The night grew colder, and Daniel stayed longer than he should have. The boy stirred restlessly on the blanket, his breaths uneven, his body too weak to hold warmth. The woman tried to shield him with her own arms, whispering lullabies in her broken voice, but her strength was fading too. Daniel rose, took off his jacket, and laid it gently over the boy. The woman's eyes widened, but she said nothing, only nodded with silent gratitude. The child's lips trembled as he tried to swallow another piece of food. Suddenly his body jerked, and he coughed violently. The mother panicked, trying to calm him, but the child's eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment he stopped breathing. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. Without hesitation, he knelt and pressed his hands to the boy's chest, steady but desperate. He had learned this long ago when he tried in vain to save his own daughter. This time, he would not fail. He breathed for the child, pressed on his small ribs until finally the boy gasped, his lungs filling with air. The woman let out a cry of relief and clutched her son to her chest, rocking back and forth. Daniel sat back, shaking, his hands trembling. The child blinked weakly and his lips moved. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but clear enough. "Papa." The word froze the room. The mother's tears spilled faster, her body trembling as she looked at Daniel. She whispered no, but the boy repeated it, reaching his small hand toward the human. Daniel caught it gently. The tiny fingers clung to him with surprising strength, as if begging him not to let go. Daniel lowered his head, his jaw tight, memories clawing at his mind. His daughter's face, pale and fading in a bed not so different from this one, her last words echoing in silence. He swallowed hard, forcing back the pain. He whispered to the boy, "I'm here." The child closed his eyes, still gripping Daniel's hand as he drifted into fragile sleep. The woman watched them both, torn between fear and hope. Finally, she whispered in broken words, "You, why you risk for us?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes dark with something deeper than pity. "Because no one else will," he said. The shelter fell silent, but outside faint noises carried through the cracked walls. Whispers, footsteps, the sound of more than one person moving in the street. Daniel rose, peering through the narrow gap of the door. In the shadows, he saw faces, hollow-eyed women clutching thin children, watching him from the alleys. They did not approach, but their eyes begged the same thing the mother had begged: food, hope, life. Daniel's stomach tightened. He stepped back inside, his mind racing. The boy's soft breathing filled the room, fragile but steady now. The mother knelt by her son, holding him as if afraid he would vanish. She looked at Daniel again, her voice breaking. "Others, they come, they will ask, 'What will you do?'" Daniel pressed his hand over his face, dragging it down slowly. He knew the answer even before she asked. Every step he had taken tonight had already set him on a path he could not leave. He turned to the sleeping child, then back to the mother. "Then I'll find more." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since he had met her, she let out a broken laugh, soft and wet with tears. Not of joy, but of disbelief. She whispered something in her tongue, words Daniel couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. She thought him mad. Daniel looked at the boy's hand still curled around his finger. Maybe he was. But he also knew he would rather be called mad than walk away. By the second night, the alleys were no longer empty. Daniel moved quietly with a bundle of bread and dried meat hidden beneath his coat. When he reached the shelter, he found not just the woman and her son, but 3 more mothers waiting outside, their children pressed against their legs. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, filled with the same desperate hunger. None of them spoke at first. They only stared at him, their silence heavier than words. The woman he had helped before stepped forward. She looked at him as if asking permission, as if afraid he might turn them away. Daniel handed her the food without hesitation. She broke it into pieces, passing it to the others. The children devoured every crumb, licking their hands for traces. The smallest one whimpered in joy at the taste of salt, a sound that stabbed Daniel's chest. Inside the shelter, the boy he had saved was stronger than before. His breaths came easier, his eyes opening more often. He smiled faintly when he saw Daniel, whispering that word again. "Papa?" The other children echoed it softly, not knowing its meaning, only that the boy spoke it with trust. The mothers exchanged uneasy looks, but none corrected them. That night, Daniel stayed longer, listening to their stories. Some had lost their homes when soldiers burned the outer districts. Some had traded everything for scraps, only to be beaten back with nothing. Each story bled into the next, and all ended the same, with hunger, with children fading in the dark. Daniel sat in silence, his fists clenched, rage burning under his skin. When he finally returned to the human quarters, whispers followed him. A pair of soldiers leaned against the wall, watching him with narrowed eyes. One muttered, "He's been sneaking around the alien side." The other chuckled. "Maybe he likes their company more than ours." They didn't confront him, not yet, but Daniel felt the weight of their suspicion like a rope, tightening around his neck. The next evening, more mothers were waiting. They carried tin cups, empty baskets, anything that could hold food. Daniel's stolen supplies were never enough, but he shared them anyway. The women lowered their heads in gratitude, their children clutching his hands, their fragile bodies pressed against his legs as if he were a shield. For the first time in years, he felt both needed and condemned. He knew the risk was growing. The missing food would be noticed, and soldiers would not laugh forever. But each time he tried to tell himself to stop, he saw the boy's small hand gripping his finger, saw the way the child whispered "Papa" with a smile, even in weakness. The sound was stronger than fear, stronger than the law. One night, as he left the alien quarter, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was one of the older soldiers, a man with a scar across his cheek. His voice was low, almost kind, but filled with warning. "You keep feeding them, Daniel. You keep feeding them, Daniel, and you'll end up in chains." Daniel met his eyes, but said nothing. The soldier sighed and stepped aside, letting him pass. Yet the words followed him like smoke, clinging to his thoughts. Chains, or worse. He walked back to his quarters, his hands empty, but his resolve heavier than ever. The hunger outside was not going away, and neither was he. The morning began with shouting in the camp. Soldiers stormed through the alleys of the alien quarter, boots kicking up dust, rifles banging against their shoulders. Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the street, his gut twisting as he saw mothers dragged from their shelters, baskets overturned, and blankets ripped apart. The excuse was simple: missing supplies, stolen rations, but Daniel knew the truth. They were looking for him. The woman clutched her child close inside the shelter. She pressed her back against the wall as the door shook from pounding fists. Her son whimpered softly, hiding his face in her chest. Daniel burst inside just as the wood cracked under the soldier's blows. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the back, guiding her through a hole in the wall. The boy clung to his neck, whispering "Papa" in a trembling voice. They stumbled into a narrow passage between broken houses. The woman's breath came in ragged sobs, but she forced her legs to move. Behind them, the soldiers shouted, tearing apart the shelter, scattering what little food had been hidden there. Daniel pushed them forward, his jaw locked tight. When the chaos faded, he led them into a ruined storeroom. The boy coughed weakly, and Daniel sat down, holding him against his chest. The woman knelt in front of him, her eyes wide with fear. "They know," she whispered. "They will come again." Daniel didn't answer. His mind was burning with anger. Hours later, back at the base, he found himself summoned to the commander's tent. The man stood tall, his eyes sharp and cold. "Supplies are missing," he said flatly, "and rumors spread that you've been wandering where you don't belong." Daniel forced his face to remain calm. "I fix machines, Commander. I go where they break." The commander studied him for a long moment, then leaned closer. "You've seen what happens to those who break the rules. Do not test me. The aliens are not your responsibility. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, but inside his chest, his heart thundered. As he left the tent, he heard laughter outside the mess hall. Soldiers joked about how the search had scared the alien women, how they had cried and begged for mercy. Daniel's fists tightened until his nails cut his palms. That night, he returned to the quarter anyway. The boy's shelter was gone, torn to pieces. The woman sat in the rubble, rocking her son in silence. She looked up when Daniel approached, and her eyes brimmed with hopelessness. "No place left," she whispered. Daniel knelt beside her, his hands steady on the boy's back. "Then we'll make one," he said. His voice carried no doubt, no hesitation. He looked around at the ruins, at the shadows of other mothers watching from a distance, and he felt the weight of their stares. The commander's warning still rang in his ears, sharp as a blade, but louder than that was the sound of the child's whisper as he pressed closer against him. "Papa?" Daniel knew then that the line had already been crossed. There was no turning back. The supply depot loomed in the darkness, its steel doors locked and guarded by silence. Daniel crouched in the shadows, his breath misting in the cold air. He knew the patrol routes, the blind spots between the floodlights. Every step forward was a betrayal of his oath, every second a reminder that if he was caught, there would be no mercy. Still, he moved. Hunger was louder than fear. Inside, the shelves were stacked high with sealed crates of food, enough to feed every starving family outside the walls. His hands trembled as he pried one open, the scent of preserved rations filling the room. He stuffed what he could into a sack, adding a bundle of medicine he found hidden in a drawer. Each item felt heavier than steel, not because of weight, but because of the risk. By the time he slipped back into the alleys, his heart was pounding like a drum. The woman was waiting in the ruins, her son lying limp across her lap. His breathing was shallow, each exhale weaker than the last. When Daniel placed the sack before her, she gasped. Her hands shook as she opened it, her eyes widening at the sight of food and medicine. She pressed her forehead to the ground in front of him, whispering thanks through broken sobs. He knelt, lifting her by the shoulders. "Feed him first," he said firmly. She obeyed at once, crushing the food into pieces small enough for the boy to swallow. She then took the medicine, guiding it carefully into his mouth. The boy stirred faintly, his small fingers twitching as he tried to grip the edge of Daniel's sleeve. Daniel's chest ached at the sight. Then came the sound of boots. Dozens of them. Echoing through the narrow street, growing louder with each second. The woman froze, her arms tightening around her son. Daniel's blood turned cold. He rose quickly, pulling her toward the back exit, but before they could move, the alley lit up with lanterns. Soldiers flooded in, their rifles aimed, their faces hard. At the center stood the commander, his expression carved from stone. His gaze went straight to Daniel, then to the open sack of stolen food at the woman's feet. Silence weighed down the night, heavier than chains. "Explain yourself," the commander said at last, his voice low but sharp as a blade. The woman trembled, shielding her son with her own body. Daniel stood between them and the rifles, his hands clenched at his sides. He could lie, he could beg, but the truth burned too hot inside him to be buried. He met the commander's eyes, his voice steady despite the danger. No child should starve while warehouses rot with food. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their weapons still raised, but something in Daniel's words hung in the air like fire. The boy coughed weakly, his small voice breaking the silence. The single word escaped his lips again, soft but clear enough for every soldier to hear. "Papa." The commander's jaw tightened. His order hung unspoken, but the moment stretched longer than it should have. Daniel felt the weight of 100 eyes upon him, and yet, for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The rifles never lowered, but neither did Daniel move. He stood tall in the center of the ruined alley, the boy's weak voice still echoing in the soldiers' ears. The alien mothers pressed closer behind him, clutching their children, their hollow eyes lit with a flicker of defiance. The commander's face was unreadable, carved with years of command, but his silence stretched like a blade against the night. One soldier shifted uneasily. Another glanced at the women's, then at the food scattered on the ground. For the first time, shame crept into their eyes. They had seen hunger every day, but hearing the boy's fragile words spoken with such trust shook them in ways orders never could. The commander finally stepped forward, his boots heavy on the dirt. He stopped in front of Daniel, so close that the steel of his pistol brushed against Daniel's chest. "You dare defy military law?" he asked, his voice a growl. Daniel didn't blink. "I dare to be human," he answered. His voice carried no trembling, only a weight that spread through the crowd like a spark in dry grass. The alien women straightened, their fear hardening into courage. One stepped forward, then another, until a wall of mothers stood at Daniel's back. Children clung to them, their thin bodies trembling but their eyes fierce. The sound of whispers rose among the soldiers. Some muttered that this had gone too far, others that punishing a man for feeding children would stain them all. The commander's hand hovered over his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Instead, his gaze swept across his men, reading their unease. He understood then that if he punished Daniel, the shame would not fall on the man alone. It would fall on every soldier who watched. At last he lowered his arm. His words were cold, but edged with a reluctant respect. "Take your food, take your medicine, but understand this, Daniel, you have crossed a line you cannot return from." Daniel bent down, lifting the boy into his arms. The child nestled against his chest, still whispering "Papa," in a breath so faint it broke the silence. Daniel looked at the commander one last time. "I already knew that," he said. As he carried the boy forward, the women parted, following him with their children in tow. Soldiers stepped aside, not by order but by choice, their rifles lowering one by one. The night swallowed the sound of boots and whispers until only the soft breathing of the child remained. In that moment, Daniel knew he was no longer just a worker, no longer just a man caught in the cracks of war. He was a line drawn in the dirt, a promise made flesh, and as long as he walked, no child in that quarter would ever beg for leftovers again.